This is a video about My Little Pony, but it's also a literary analysis that contains mature themes. It has been correctly labeled as not intended for children in full cooperation with COPPA regulations. Furthermore, it contains some subject matter which may be upsetting to some viewers, such as the human experience. Hey dudes, dudettes, and doodles! In the first episode of this series, we talked about the criminal justice system, criminal justice reform, and a bit about mental health. It was a pretty heavy episode, particularly considering that we're talking about rainbow ponies. The point of this series is to take the lessons from My Little Pony and translate them into messages that adults could use, sort of see how they stack up. I'm not an expert on any of the stuff I talk about, I'm just a random person who likes casual media analysis. So because of that, I want this series to be as conversational as possible. Let me know what you agreed with, what you disagreed with, if there are any ways of looking at this episode that you think I missed. I know that response videos aren't quite as popular as they once were, but I think if this video prompted you to make one, that'd be really cool. With that out of the way, Part 1, Introduction Part 2. The episode we're talking about today is Season 1, Episode 4, titled Applebuck Season. No, you didn't miss anything. I did skip Episode 3. I just didn't really have enough to say about it to justify making a whole video. At the end of Season 1, if I get that far, I'm planning on making a video where I just, really quickly go through the episodes I skipped. Before even rewatching this episode, I knew there were a couple different ways I could look at it. The two I was trying to pick from were burnout and individualism. Obviously, from the title you can tell which one I chose, but I just wanted to quickly mention both so that we can have a starting place when we start getting into the episode, and so that we can keep in mind that there are many ways to look at even a relatively simple piece of media. I also encourage you to watch the episode on your own so that you can draw your own conclusions. Otherwise, while we go forward, keep both burnout and individualism in the back of your brain. Part 2, Applebuck Season. This episode mostly follows Applejack, who's the cowgirl pony. It occurs to me that the term cowgirl sounds like it means something different in the My Little Pony universe. But anyway, her family opens an apple orchard, and it's that time of year where the apples have to be harvested. Applejack's brother is injured, and apparently the Apple family has no other employees to care for their massive orchard, so Applejack decides she's gonna harvest all of the apples all by herself. Applejack is the town's most dependable pony. Everyone knows it. Ask Applejack for help, and she'll pull through. Most of this episode is dedicated to watching Applejack help different characters with various tasks as she slowly becomes more and more exhausted and the outcomes become more and more disastrous, the implication being that all the time she isn't doing those things, she's harvesting apples. Despite her friends offering to help, Applejack is determined to do it all by herself. Eventually, Applejack's refusal to help ends up actually getting a lot of people hurt. Twilight puts her hoof down, and Applejack realizes that she actually will need help to have any hope of doing her job, which is at most half done at this point. I think it's pretty clear how the themes of burnout or individualism can work for this one. You've got Applejack working so hard on something that she might enjoy doing, but that is causing her harm nonetheless, i.e. burnout. And on the other hand, it's only causing so much harm because she's insisting on working alone, ergo individualism. Or anti-individualism, I guess. The episode ends with Twilight writing a letter to Princess Celestia about how it's important to accept help from your friends. That's supposed to be the main takeaway for this episode, and that's why I'm going to talk about individualism rather than burnout. I want to see if I can stay as close to the intended message of the episode as I can, because, like I said before, translating those messages to work for an older audience is kind of the entire point of this series. That said, feel free to deviate from that if you do want to respond. Part 3, Individualism versus Collectivism. If you've taken even a small foray into politics, you're probably aware of this dichotomy. The idea is that some ideologies, such as capitalism or liberalism, support the good of the individual, while other ideologies, such as Communism and Socialism, support the good of the collective. I'm not going to define any of those ideologies, but I'll leave links in the description to videos that do. I do want to give descriptions for individualism and collectivism since they'll be relevant to our analysis. Based on the research I've done, they seem to be mostly layman's terms and don't seem to have a lot of practical, descriptive use for any actual ideology. It's also a false dichotomy, which you may have already realized. If something is good for the collective, it must by definition be good for most individuals. This also may be why it seems that only people who call themselves individualist use the terms frequently. If you care about most people, you also care about the individual. But if you only care about some individuals, you don't have to care about most people. The argument could be, and has also been made frequently, that things that are bad for the collective can't actually be good for an individual, and people have different reasons for thinking that, but I'm not going to get into it right now. The point is, the idea that you must either support the collective or the individual is kind of absurd. So I guess I'm not really defining the terms so much as rejecting them entirely. Also, I noted a bit earlier that capitalism is often used as an example of an individualist society. And I feel the need to point out that under capitalism, most people are forced to throw away their values and their passions in order to support themselves and their family. So I guess it's individualist in the sense that a few individuals profit greatly, but it's actually terrible for most individuals. So if up until this point you've supported capitalism on the grounds that it supports individual freedom, maybe get a bit curious about that. And maybe check out the source I'm showing on screen. There's another problem with this false dichotomy that goes beyond it just not making any sense. A lot of people think that individualism is the right way to go because humans are individualistic by nature. This idea permeates a lot of our society because of a lot of different philosophers, but namely the founding fathers of the US, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Max Stirner. I'm not Philosophy Tube, and I'm not going to get into any of these ding-dongs in detail. The gist of it is that they thought humans were selfish by nature, and that society constrains that selfishness to make people act morally in a way that's essentially unnatural. Their ideas about that concept were different. Some of them thought that society was good for constraining the selfishness of humanity, and at least one thought there should be no constraints on the individual. They all had one thing in common though. They were all wrong. People are obviously individualistic to some degree, at least in the sense that we're aware that we're individuals. A lot of these people base their ideas on the state of nature, which is the concept that there was a time before society where everyone acted in their own self-interest. But the state of nature never really existed. We know, thanks to archaeology, that pre-society humans were heavily social and even collectivist, one might say. Just on a practical level, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to expect one person to have all the skills required to create a good quality of life. Furthermore, we can look at this not just from a historical perspective, but also a psychological one. The idea of solitary confinement, usually, is to give prisoners time alone so that they can reflect on what they've done. But actual research into solitary confinement has shown that the lack of human interaction can actually cause a person's identity to break down, because without another person there, you have no one you can relate yourself to, and no one to even check if your surroundings are real. No person can be an island, not practically and not emotionally, because you aren't an individual without another person to be individuated from. Part 4. Ugh. So yeah, Applejack isn't in solitary confinement. I just wanted to bring up the arguments for individualism to try to avoid as many people as possible, like, trying to argue for them in the comment section. Obviously, I didn't go into them, like, in a whole lot of detail, and I didn't bring up all the arguments, but I just wanted to talk about like the core ideas instead of arguments based on those ideas, which is why they may have seemed a little bit removed from the episode at hand. There's a lot of helping in this episode. First Applejack helping her friends, and then finally accepting help from her friends at the end. You could, I think pretty easily, interpret Applejack's actions in this episode as kind of patronizing, like she thinks she's better than her friends to some extent. After all, she does seem to think that getting help is for other people, and that she's above it. That would obviously be a pretty cynical take, though. It's more likely that she just didn't want her friends to be caused any trouble. I said that sentence very well. But regardless, the outcome is the same either way, regardless of her intentions. So, I mean, a lot of people get hurt. Like, pretty badly, too. If you haven't watched the episode, I'm talking like dozens of people in the hospital because Applejack refuses to be helped. People who support individualism tend to say that individuals should be left to their own devices and not interfered with, even if they end up hurting themselves. But that outlook kind of assumes that hurting yourself doesn't also hurt the people around you. Let's say you stay up a whole bunch of nights in a row, and it's all well and good to joke about sleep deprivation, but if you snap at someone because you're tired or make a careless mistake when you're, say, driving, for example, that doesn't just hurt you. You cannot avoid interacting with people at all times. Remember, even on the internet, there are real people behind the accounts you comment on. And also, we need people to be healthy and alive and stuff. You need food, clothes, healthcare. What, are you just going to become an expert on all health who also knows how to farm, sew, and build houses? That sounds super practical. Let me know how you're doing when you're 75 years old and suddenly way less spry than you once were. We all need people. You know the saying, it takes a village to raise a child? Well, people say it because it's true. Children need food and doctors and teachers and friends in order to grow into an adult. And what I'm asking you to consider is that maybe it isn't only children who need a village to teach them.